Pierrette is amazing. She's already got a network in town. This women's hiking group, I guess, is now that, you know, took its toll physically on her, but I'm glad she's past that. You guys must really do some extreme hiking, I guess. Pierrette Hondagneu-Sotelo, I'll get it right someday. French is not my language, but Sotelo I can handle. Is a professor of sociology at the University of Southern California. Her research interests include immigration, gender, religion, and the pragmatics of the informal labor sector. She's extraordinarily well published. If I read through all her books and articles, we'd use up all the available time. Her single-authored books include Paradise Transplanted, Migration in the Making of California Gardens, God's Heart Has No Borders, Religious Activists for Immigrant Rights, and Domestica, Immigrant Workers Cleaning and Caring in the Shadows of Affluence, and many other books as well. She's been honored with a number of professional and civic awards, including the Distinguished Career Award from the American Sociological Association and also the Max Weber Award of the same organization, which is a really big deal. We're delighted to have her here as a Weatherhead Fellow, which was funded by the Weatherhead Foundation. It's one of our oldest, and maybe our oldest resident scholar endowment, and it's arguably the most coveted and competitive because it has no restrictions as to topics. So we have about 100 applications for 2 positions, so the fact that she got one of them says a lot about the quality of her work. The title of her colloquium today is Reconceptualizing Immigration as a Homemaking Process, the Latinos in South LA Research Projects. Please join me in a warm Santa Fe welcome for Pierrette.
Wow, thank you. Lower this a bit. Well, thanks everybody for coming out on a rainy day when it would be so cozy to stay home or in your office. I'm so grateful to have the Weatherhead Fellowship and to be here at SAR, one of the most beautiful sites on earth, and what a great staff. You know, Maria Spray, who coordinates all the visiting scholar activities, started communicating with us about 6 months ago with paperwork and all kinds of information. You know, Paul Ryer has been fantastic. Laura in the library is, you know, already giving me the books I've requested, and Doug today helped me with the setup. It really moves along well here. So I'm a sociologist of immigration, and all of my books, all of my work really try to understand people's motivations, their actions, their meanings in a broader historical and social structural context. It's very simple, trying to understand people's biographies in a larger historical context. And in recent years, I've gotten more focused on the importance of place. I'm learning a lot from colleagues in geography. So what I'm going to talk about today, the Latinos in South LA project, is a very subject-based, by which I mean we're really interested in understanding people's experiences, their voices, their perceptions, and its place. Right, it's focused on a very unique place. It's part of a team study, as I'll say more about in a moment. I conducted it. I was the principal investigator together with my colleague, Manuel Pastor, a very accomplished, talented economist. So there's a quantitative component. I'll present some of the mapping that he and that part of the team did. And then there was a qualitative component of in-depth interviews that myself and 4 other people did. Then that's largely what I'll be speaking about. But what we're looking at is this Latino demographic transformation in the historically Black parts of the city. Community leaders, at the moment when we started this study, I was co-directing the Center for the Study of Immigrant Integration at USC with Manuel. Community leaders came to us and they said, you know, we need data and we seek a positive framing and a platform for sort of an individual or independent Latino voice, not one that is erasing African American concerns, but you know, one that works together. So before I begin the talk, I brought a little show and tell. because what am I doing here in this office? I have a beautiful office up here by a gorgeous apricot tree that is the size of a California oak. It's spectacular. And right now, I'm reading through these. These are individual transcripts. They're verbatim transcripts of the interviews we conducted. As you'll see, we have 100 interviews for the LiSLA project, and then I have a satellite project on public parks and urban community gardens with another 57 interviews. Now, all of the LiSLA ones have been coded, and they're these fancy little software programs now. We use Deduce. I was part of a team. We sat down. We came up with 57 codes, more child codes. It was too many. And 2 PhD students methodically went through these on screen and coded little bits of data. So if we're talking about experience of violence, experience of civic engagement, I can just go online and I can write civic engagement and boom. But these are like little sound bites, little tidbits. So I'm taking my early time here at SAR to do the deep dive back into these transcripts and try to get the whole gestalt, try to understand the context in the person's life. Sometimes it's interesting, sometimes it's a little boring, but I'm happy I'm doing it. Let me give you just like a little signposting of the talk. I'm going to begin by talking about some of the theories that we've used to understand immigration and why I think they're unsatisfactory for this project. So with this project, what we're trying to do is, understand the Latino experience as it's been lived in South LA, but I'm also trying to reshape, reformulate theories for understanding immigration elsewhere, more broadly. So I'm going to start with some of that. Then I will describe in some detail the place of South LA. And I've got these maps. I'll try to go over how the political economy of the place has changed over the 20th century to the present. And then I'll present what people said to us in the interviews and what we're making of that. So this hashtag, I'm already home, appeared, I don't know, some point during the presidential election when some of our candidates were suggesting, we need to step up with deportation, and immigrants, second generation US born, responded by saying, what? Go back home to Mexico? This is like telling somebody who's African American, go back to Africa when you've lived here for 7 generations. I'm already home was the hashtag that appeared. And here's just a little scene from South LA with Martin Luther King, Obama, and Benito Juarez, right, Mexico's first indigenous president, and these little kids kind of marching along. At the same time, about the same time, you may have seen this around here, these kind of I love Michoacan, I love LA, well, I love South LA appeared. And this became really important because South Los Angeles, which has been rebranded from South Central, had been such a reviled, place that was seen as dangerous, as always negative. So there's been this kind of pride of place and love of place that I think that bumper sticker represents. So what do we know about the rise of immigration in the late 20th century? Well, as Castles and Miller tell us, it's the age of global migration. We could put many, many more arrows showing various flows around the world. But many times Americans, I think, feel like the whole world is coming to the United States. Well, actually, everybody's on the move everywhere. It's south-north. It's Eastern Hemisphere to Western Hemisphere. It's within the Southern Hemisphere, within Asia, many different complicated migrations are going on simultaneously. Now, it is true that the points of origin for US immigrants have changed radically since 1965. Prior to 1965, vast majority of immigrants to the United States were European in origin. After 1965, for reasons I'll explain later, it's Latin America and it's Asia and the Caribbean. Mexico remains by far the #1 source of immigrants, not only because of the proximity, but because of our long structural interdependencies and symbiotic relationships. So about 30% of the US foreign-born are of Mexican origin, far outpacing #2 and #3, which are Chinese, Filipinos, and other groups. Now, the points of destination, I should have a map of the United States. The points of destination for immigrants have changed. It used to be the Southwest, New York City, Chicago, Florida. Well, today, immigrants and Mexican immigrants go to all 50 states, including Alaska, including Hawaii. The South has emerged as a new destination for Mexican immigrants in recent years, which has inaugurated this new scholarship on Black Latino relationships. So there's books by Helen Merrow, Vanessa Rivas, Angeles Ducey that have focused on that. It's also, it's the age of migration, but it's also, I want to emphasize, a new age of exclusions, of border walls, not just in the United States, in Europe, and elsewhere in the world. So it's a new era for us, I think. These are three broad theoretical frameworks that have really prevailed in the social science literature on immigration. Assimilation, I think, and I'll go into these in a little more detail, comes up with the early 20th century school of sociology that came up around the University of Chicago. And the basic idea is that immigrants first learn the language, they change their cultural values, and as they do, they experience greater integration, incorporation, assimilation, and social mobility. Transnationalism is a different framework that came up in the 1980s. I try to remind my students that many good things began in anthropology, and transnationalism did, with Roger Rouse and Nina Glick-Schiller. And here was kind of a realization that actually many people are living their lives, their families, their religion, their civic groups across borders. So this focus on social circuits that span nation-state borders. And then more recently, where a lot of the research is going is on racialization and crimmigration, right? The criminalization of immigration, which really looks at how laws and racial structures serve as mechanisms for exclusion. These are the basic research questions. I'll come back to the theory in a moment that we're trying to answer with this project. Really, how have Latino immigrants made themselves at home in this historically Black neighborhoods of South LA? How do they and their second-generation children, by second generation, I mean their children who were either born and raised in South LA or who came as very young children and have been raised as Angelenos. And then my side project that I'm not really going to talk about today is about how this is transformations that we see in these public green spaces, which are scarce in South LA as they are in all poor racial ethnic minority neighborhoods. And so as we go forward, trying to build this paradigm for understanding immigrant homemaking, we're playing around with some concepts. Spatial assimilation is the way sociologists of immigration have traditionally understood immigration. And by this they mean immigrants first come to the inner city, they're working in factories, they're working and living in the least desirable housing. As they do better, they move out to the suburbs. Well, that happens for some, but what we're seeing in South LA is Latino home ownership and a sinking down of roots. So we're trying to understand spatial transformation. How has this changed neighborhoods? Recoded what the city looks like. Ethnic secession is also a concept from the Chicago School of Sociology, right? They were looking at Italians, Poles, Slavic, Greek immigrants, and Black migrants who came to Chicago, worked in, the steel plants, in factories, and as they moved out, new groups moved in. So that was called ethnic secession, right? Maybe Jewish entrepreneurs sell their little businesses to Korean immigrants who become ethnic entrepreneurs. And rather than ethnic secession, with Latinos taking over Black homes, neighborhoods, and businesses, we're playing around with this term of ethnic, the idea of racial ethnic sedimentation. So the elements of Black culture, history, legacies, and people are part of this Latino transition. And rather than seeing a monoracial identity, we're really getting a strong idea of racial identities being very place-based. And with some important differences between first and second generation. And then there's this thing about homemaking that I think really gets at what the immigrant project is about, more than assimilation or transnationalism. So here I have all these, this is not so interesting to go through, but here's all the people who've talked about assimilation, from Robert Park at the early Chicago School up to, my current colleague, Jody Aegis Vallejo, who's talking about the expanding Mexican-American middle class, right, that has moved into formal positions in management and the professions. Alba and Nee did give us an important book about 10 years ago, reminding us that assimilation is never a unilinear process of, emerging into a static Anglo-Protestant thing. That is always changing. The mainstream is changing. The foods we eat, the ways Yiddish has come into our language, etc. Transnationalism, as I said, was really pioneered by anthropologists like Roger Rouse and Nina Glick-Schiller and her colleagues in the book Nations Unbound, and other sociologists have carried this out, looking at how, as I mentioned, various institutions are, bilateral and lived across borders. Interestingly, I think the high point of transnationalism is over. I'm happy to talk about that later. And right now, I would say racialization, crimmigration, and the understanding of illegalities and various kinds of liminal legalities is where a lot of the exciting scholarship is, starting with Nicholas DiGenova from anthropology, May Nye from history, and the rest are colleagues from sociology who've all written important books on this topic. I'm going to keep going a little faster just so I can get to the storytelling. So how does this immigrant homemaking perspective differ? Well, I'm kind of looking for inspiration here, drawing on some ideas from colleagues in Mexico, Italy, and Canada. In Canada, Nathaniel Lauster and his student recently published this book which is about Chinese immigrants coming to Vancouver. And Vancouver, you may know, is a very Asian city, as is parts of LA now. San Francisco used to be, but the San Gabriel Valley, the part of Pasadena where I live, is increasingly Chinese. And many affluent Chinese immigrants have come to the US, not for jobs as laborers, but they're really looking for a home base. Some of them are entrepreneurs, some of them are in professions. There are labor migrants as well. But I think I like Nathaniel Lauster, who really draws attention to the work of making a new home, right? Kind of devising new projects going forward for your family. Rafael Alarcón is an old colleague. We were in graduate school together in the 80s in Berkeley. He now works at COLEF, that's Mexico's premier immigration institute. And this study was published originally in Mexico and then translated by UC Press. And not really in the homemaking venue, but again, reminding us that integration is a process, not, this, one-directional sort of thing. It's diverse. And one finding, this was a really interesting study. They studied people from Zacatecas who came in the 70s, Oaxacans who came to LA in the 80s, and people from Veracruz in the 90s. So they're kind of looking at different stages of settlement, really. And of their 90 interviewees, only 7 people said they plan to go back to Mexico. Now, this is what people said. We don't really know what they're going to do, but this is a sea change from what you would have seen 25 years ago, where the dream was always return. There's various reasons for that, but there's real, again, I think more evidence, kind of, putting down roots. My colleague Paolo Boccagni in Italy has written this small theory book in the Palgrave series, where he's really trying to lay out a theory of what migrant homemaking means, right? It's a special relationship with place. He's putting attention on materiality as well as relationships. And then this whole level of affect, how people get a sense of security, familiarity, feel a sense of control in their homes. Right now, he's leading this massive study funded by European Research Council. It's 6 countries of origin, 5 countries of settlement in Europe. It's huge, team, but all of it in this kind of homemaking venue. Adriano Cancellieri, another Italian whose work I've liked very much, who talks about homemaking as a process of kind of re-territorialization, again, pushing back against the transnationalist perspective. Oh, and then I'm citing myself. I've written a couple articles on what's happening in urban community gardens. This part of my study has included more ethnography as well as interviews. These are really men's spaces. This is a photo from Watts, and where I'm really looking at the kind of gardening that goes on is not only recreation and leisure, but really kind of a recreation of the homeland, right? Planting nopales, very iconic, papalo, other kinds of vegetables that people grew back home. And they're really also making claims on the city, changing what it looks like, and really saying, wow, we have a right to be here. So back to the LiSLA study. How did we do the research? So on the left-hand column, I've put basically what I'm working with here, which is these 100 audio recorded interviews with Latino residents in 3 neighborhoods. 60 second generation people who were between the ages of 18 and 42, 40 first generation immigrants. We had slightly more women than men. We used a semi-structured interview guide. We asked, what had you expected to find in South LA? What did you come here? What were your experiences? These are, interviews that lasted between 1 and 2 hours. Open-ended interviews, not surveys. And they were conducted by me and Veronica Montes, who was our postdoc, now professor at Bryn Mawr, and Walter Thompson Hernandez, a really incredible RA who I'll be co-authoring with also. He's also writing about Blaxicans in South LA, who are young people who have a Black parent and a Mexican parent and feel this new kind of identity and bridge. On the right-hand column, I've put up there what my colleague Manuel and the data analyst are doing. They've done this complicated census analysis and mapping. I get to show you some of the clean products from that. And they've also interviewed, I did a handful of the civic leader interviews, 25 interviews with African Americans in Watts. And we have a report out. This is what the beginning of the interview guide looked like. All of the first generation ones I did were in Spanish. The second generation ones were usually in English. And here is a basic map of South LA. It's a vast area. It's 50 square miles. It has a population close to 900,000 people. Like almost half of all of New Mexico is in this one urban neighborhood. You know, we call everything by our freeway numbers in LA. So here's the 405, there's the 10, downtown LA would be up there. LAX, if you fly into LAX, this is the flight path. I'll say more about this in a moment. Let me describe the place a little bit. If you come to Los Angeles as a tourist, you might get a little tourist map that tells you where Disneyland is and Venice and, you know, downtown LA, but South LA is usually not on the maps, although sometimes people do go to Watts to visit the historic Watts Towers, built by Simon Rodia years ago. This is really kind of like the forgotten parts of LA. LA has a lot of beautiful nature. It can't match Santa Fe, but we do have mountains and beaches. But this is pretty much a very flat, horizontal expanse of the city, far away from the canyons, the mountains, and the beaches. And it's really overlaid with a grid of avenues. East LA is further up there. It's kind of East LA is covered up by the legend. East LA is dense, and it has, you know, it had all these freeways carved into it, you know, the 60, the 10, the 5. And South LA basically doesn't. I mean, it's, you know, we've got the 110, so you've got a lot of boulevards, very little tree canopy. There are parts of the city that do have trees, but it's not unusual to see people sitting, waiting for the bus, you know, on the shadow of a palm tree, which does not offer a lot of shade. Here's how the population has shifted. LA is a multiracial, diverse city, but as you will see here, South LA, which was 70% African American in 1980, is today about 30%. And I'm going to break this down further. The brown is signifies the black population. The blue is the expanding Latino population. And the white, the Asian Pacific Islander, and the other populations are very, very small. So these are pretty much, you know, all Latino, all black neighborhoods. So how's the political economy of South LA changed over the 20th century? In the early 20th century, it was developed as a place for modest single-family homes for working men, white working men and their families. There's a beautiful history book called My Blue Heaven that tells the story of Southgate, one of the local kind of inner ring suburbs there, and Becky Nicolaitis called it LA's Detroit, right? 1,000 square foot homes on little plots of land, 3,000, 4,000 square feet. Henry Huntington, local real estate developer, you know, we used to have an electric car system. He put these red cars out. He owned conveniently the property, and he built up all of these neighborhoods. In the early 20th century, LA's economy is shifting from agriculture to industry. Automobiles, the Firestone plant, Firestone tire plant, first aircraft, later aerospace with the Hughes Aerospace, and of course trucking from the ports, food handling. LA even had some oil, of course the movie industry. And African Americans arrived with the first group of Spaniards who came. That was a very mixed racial group, but really African Americans from the South began arriving in the early 20th century. They came as Pullman porters, worked in domestic service. And then, as you may know, there was a huge migration of African Americans from the South between early 20th century up to about 1970. 6 million African Americans flee racial violence, flee poverty and Jim Crow to go to Chicago, New York, Cleveland, better opportunities. And they also went to Los Angeles. There was a bigger push in World War II when LA, we had World War II munitions plants, and certainly white workers were coming. LA has always been a segregated city. There was a strong color line, but it was also seen as something of a housing mecca for African Americans. The great early sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, African-American intellectual who wrote one of our first sociology texts called The Philadelphia Negro, said of African-Americans in LA, they are, without a doubt, the most beautifully housed group of color people in the United States. And in fact, black home ownership was much higher than it was in places like Chicago or New York at that moment. Plus, you could have an orange tree in your backyard, palm trees, sunshine. The California dream. So the African American population has declined, as you saw in the graph I presented. Why? Well, mass incarceration is one. As you know, our drug war has disproportionately put black people, and especially black men, increasingly Latino men too, but especially black men behind bars. In the 80s and 90s, South LA, in this moment of deindustrialization, when factories left, was besieged by a lot of inner city violence. You've seen these movies about the Bloods and the Crips and all kinds of the crack cocaine crisis. And basically any black working family who could left South LA. Where did they go? Well, there was an exodus to affordable, safer, middle-class exurbs. Exurbs are like suburbs, but they're further out. So there was a big movement towards San Bernardino County, about an hour, 15 minutes east, Riverside, San Bernardino, where the black population doubled between 1990 and 2010. Also further north to Lancaster, Palmdale, to the Antelope Valley, where the black population tripled. There's also been a return migration to the south, and it's not only from LA, it's happening from other cities around the north, with many black professionals going to Atlanta, others going to Charleston, South Carolina, Houston, where there's jobs, more affordable housing, safer neighborhoods. Las Vegas, Nevada was also a magnet. Some people have said this is kind of a reversal of the Great Migration from the Jim Crow South. In Los Angeles, there are still black people, to be sure. In Watts is still 30% black, but many African Americans have moved further north, further west. I'll show you different neighborhoods. So Leimert Park, I think, is today kind of gone through like a black cultural renaissance. Baldwin Hills is an affluent, beautiful neighborhood on this plateau that is, there was white flight from there, and many black professional families live there, Ladera Heights. As I said, this is happening elsewhere, not just LA. So San Francisco, Oakland, of course, are just very, very expensive places to live today, but we're seeing it in Berkeley. We're seeing it from East Palo Alto, located near Stanford, and also DC, Chicago, Detroit are losing. I was at a meeting. It was sort of like a civic, cultural leaders meeting, and Larry Aubrey, who's this longtime African-American elderly gentleman, activist, jazz musician, journalist for the black newspaper, this Black Sentinel, said, speaking about the exodus, the change in this one particular neighborhood, he said, we got what we wanted, but we lost what we had. So deep sense of loss, of sadness, right? Loss of institutions and place. What's the story of Mexican immigration? How does this fit in here? Well, it's important to remember that 1848, California was Mexico, as was Santa Fe. There was migration that began in the 1880s. And in the early 20th century, most Mexican immigration to the Southwest was in these primary industries, railroads, fields, eventually factories. East Los Angeles really became the mecca of Mexican-American life. In California, maybe the capital nationwide. So neighborhoods like East LA and the great Boyle Heights, which was actually integrated with Jews and Japanese Americans, increasingly became known as Mexican, Chicano neighborhood. But Mexicans were elsewhere. The citrus was a big industry in developing Southern California. It was, what they called the Orange Empire. And the navel oranges expanded throughout the San Gabriel Valley, which is going east, like from Pasadena through Riverside. And you had Valencias in Orange County, each of which required different kinds of labor force. But the navels needed a year-round labor force. So you had Mexican-American, Mexican immigrant home ownership back then in places like Montebello, El Monte, places like where Claremont Colleges is located. But throughout most of the early part of the 20th century, Mexicans provided an elastic source of labor, an elastic source of cheap labor for agriculture. So we had a first Bracero program, a temporary contract worker program that was quite small around World War I. During the Great Depression, there was a mass deportation, euphemistically called repatriation, with 500,000 Mexicans, including US-born citizens, shipped by railroad cars back to Mexico. And then World War II rolled around, and the United States is in crisis. And, employers, agricultural employers had always had their enganchistas, their labor contractors who would take the railroad down and recruit workers. But then, beginning in 1942, we had a bilateral, binational agreement with Mexico that allowed men to come work for a specific period of time. Now, this went on until 1964. All of you know World War II ended way, way before 1964, but labor needs stayed the same. This was a primarily male, temporary, circular migration. Sure, there was some family settlement and colonias settling, around Denver, LA, elsewhere. But a big change comes in 1965 with we have the end of the Bracero program in 64. Happy to talk about that later. And then we get the Immigration Act of 1965, which allows for family reunification. If you yourself can legalize, and many former braceros were able to do this for their employers who needed them and who needed them to be there as a stable workforce, you can then immigrate your family, your close family members. 65 is also important because it's the end of the racial exclusions that had forbade migration from Asia and the Middle East. So what do we see in post-World War II California? Well, diversification of employer demand, creating this new structure of opportunities for Mexican immigrants who get work not just in the fields, but in expanding cities, suburbs, right? It's a boom time, right? Construction is growing, all kinds of services, factories. And my PowerPoint is sort of cut off there, but we also get age and gender diversification leading to these permanent family settlement and the creation, the growth of immigrant Latino barrios in places where they weren't previously. And then back to South LA. What's happening in late 20th century South LA? Well, the Watts riots, rebellions, which were started as by the same problem we see today of police stopping a black man in his automobile, and the community felt they'd had enough, and the city burned for days, self-inflicted wound. Ensuing white flight from areas around South LA, including grocery stores, stores like Grants or Thrifties who see its costs are too high, it's too risky to stay there, divestment from the city, local authorities, and importantly, this decline in manufacturing, which is happening elsewhere in our Rust Belt cities around the same time. So it's sort of like the perfect storm for joblessness and the rise of gang violence and crack cocaine. So now I'm going to go through these slides very, very fast. these are the slides put together by the quantitative portion of our team. And the dark portion here shows, the dark green is the percentage of the South LA that was greater than 65% African American in 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. So to show you the inverse, let's look at the percent Latino in 1970. It's way up at the top in the northern end, just not far from USC where I work and close to downtown where there were lots of garment factories. And then on the furthest on the east side, a little corner down below, and you could see it just grows throughout that period. So this is a vast area. We couldn't focus on all of the different areas, so we chose 3 different neighborhoods. That's Watts down below, and each one has its unique characteristics. Watts actually, to my eye, looks like it's the poorest rundown of the neighborhoods, but actually the rate of home ownership and per capita income is the highest of our 3 different study areas. It has a kind of rural feel to it that very lax zoning, so you'll see, I've seen ponies in people's front yards. And then you'll see, like, here's like a little, industrial shop that probably is putting pollutants in the soil. Watts today is about 70%, is 70% Latino, 30% African American. Up here, in the top right-hand corner is historic South Central, which I would say is the closest thing that LA ever had to Harlem. This was the epicenter, the cultural center for Black life in the 20th century when so there was a famous hotel, the Dunbar Hotel and Jazz Club. Cab Calloway came to town, Lena Horne, they all stayed there. W.E.B. Du Bois, very famous, Black institutions there. Today, historic South Central is 88% Latino. African Americans still drive in to go to church. There's an annual jazz club. It's revered as a place for African American culture, but also a sense of lost. The housing stock here is really dense and rickety. It was bad in the early 20th century, and it's still bad. And then Vermont Square, Vermont Slauson is in the middle. That too is, I believe, 69% Latino and has a lot less name recognition and less strong place identity. Has some beautiful housing stock, beautiful little craftsman bungalows. Now LA's finally getting with it and putting in a metro lines. And as the metro lines come in, a lot of concern about gentrification and displacement. So here's a home in Watts where I have been many times. I conducted interviews here. It's next to an urban community garden. I always like to point out these Italian cypress trees because when Anglo-Americans came to LA in the 1880s, they said, let's make it look like Italy. And so they planted these sorts of things. But in the backyard, there's a whole host in this Guatemalan family's home of tropical fruit trees. Maguey, other things. It's also a home that incorporates work. The homeowner who lives here works as a jeweler downtown, but he's got his little workshop in the back. And I want to point out the bars on the windows, very LA thing. Fences, bars, lockdown on the houses is what you see a lot. So I'm going to go through these now quickly, what people really said. So, when we talked to the first generation Latino immigrants about what it was like to come to Watts or historic South Central in the 80s and 90s, they told us about their fear and the gangs. If they had any information at all, this was going to be a dangerous neighborhood. And in fact, it was a dangerous neighborhood in the 80s and the 90s with gang violence, over-policing, under-policing, And residents expressed a lot of fear about Black youth. And I got a lot of unbridled racist comments. No colorblind racism here. A lot of like, oh yeah, you know, there were a lot, it's better now. There's not so many Blacks here. But as you can see from these quotes, you know, fear of gangs, and as the community changes, fear not only of the Bloods and the Crips, but also from Cholillos, from Latino gang members, you know. And we heard a lot of experiences of street violence, people wearing little gold chains like this, having them yanked while they're waiting at the bus stop, break-ins, and worse, knifings, various assaults. Can you read this from back there? Is it kind of small? I'll just read you the quote from the bottom. One woman says, you know, in Spanish, well, the house didn't have fences, but my husband, put them up. Even so, as we were about to celebrate our silver anniversary, they got in through the front door, and as we were about to celebrate, they stole everything. They came, you know, they stole their savings, everything, including the money we'd saved for our silver anniversary. Now, there was a lot of fear because of African Americans, because of this kind of crisis of South LA in the 80s and the 90s. But I think it's also important to underscore, and part of what we need to write about is anti-Black racism that Latino immigrants bring with them. Mestizaje, mestizo identities prevail in Central America and in Mexico, but in El Salvador and in Honduras in particular, and I want to say African slaves were brought to all of those countries, but there's always been an association that whiteness and Spanishness is the best, and Blackness is to be distanced from. And it's also part of the process, as you'll see some of the quotes reflect, of learning Americanism. So what did Latino immigrants do when they got here? Well, we're using the scientific term shutting in and shutting out, which really gets at what they did. I already suggested this move to really changing the materiality of houses with fences, bars, incredible locks. As I went in people's front doors, you know, 2 dead bolts. Some people have these kind of like iron bird cage things around the front porch, right? Different layers of security. People developed elaborate spatial mobility strategies and directives for their children, right? You're going to walk to school, but you're not walking through the park. You're not walking this way. Anybody who could would avoid taking the bus. Not everybody had an automobile, though. A lot of Latino families bused their children out to school, to the San Fernando Valley, to the West Side. So you had a lot of kids. A lot of our second generation interviewees were, you know, getting up early in the morning, taking the bus. And I think it's important to emphasize there were Black children doing this too at that moment, where schools were just seen not as a place for learning, but just as an unsafe place. So we found in general a lot of social distance from African Americans among the first generation. They would say, nos saludamos nomás, oh, we just say hello. We say hello and goodbye to our neighbors, with some significant exceptions. But we also found in the shutting in and shutting out a great deal of pleasure that people took in their homes, both the homeowners and renters, who found in South LA, within the walls of their home, within their yards, a sense of freedom. We can play our music louder here than we could in these tight little apartments. East LA had too many regulations. I can keep some chickens here, you know, kind of bringing the rancho in. Working in the driveway, men, you know, doing like some mechanic work. Women often will have like a little, what would you call it, like a flea market, like selling used goods in front of the driveway. So there is also this sense of pleasure, freedom, a sense of autonomy in the home. But there's no monolithic experience or voice. So up here, these are two pseudonyms I've given to women, and they're almost identical because the women are almost identical, but they have different stories. These were both interviews I conducted with Salvadoran women who are about my age. They're in their late 50s, their early 60s. They both came to South LA in the same moment. They had been elsewhere in LA, in the East Side or in downtown. I'll start with Zandra Castro. So she was one of these people who said, one of the many who said, well, it's better now that there's less black people here. And in the interview, she told me how she and her husband had scrimped and saved. She had worked in the garment factories. Her husband was a mechanic. They bought a house for $80,000 or so, and they moved to South LA. And lo and behold, it's next door to the crack house. And people are coming by all hours of night, you know, just chaotic, violent. They didn't feel safe going out. Throughout the interview, she told me she'd been, you know, robbed on the street, and she also told me many stories of what we might call microaggressions from African Americans. So she told me, you know, the black teachers at school were unfair to my child. They, you know, punished them unfairly. She told me that she had lupus. I guess she still has lupus, but she had some kind of discoloration in her skin. She claimed that the black mothers at the school discriminated against her because of this unsightly skin disease. She claimed that she had lost a baby at 8 months because the African-American lab technician at the hospital had done something. So when I'm interviewing somebody like this, my job is to be empathetic, to not judge, but I probe, I ask questions. And so I was asking, well, how about teachers? No. And, you know, co-work? No. You know, neighbors. And then, you know, she conceded, oh, son un poco más amable ahora. They're a little nicer now. African Americans are a little nicer now. But then we got to talking about family. And guess what? Her daughter in high school had a black boyfriend. And Mrs. Castro said she cried for 3 days straight. Woohoo, my daughter. Well, her daughter marries the African-American boyfriend, and now they live there with them, and this is the best, súper bien, he's the best son-in-law. He's even learned a little Spanish, you know, we love his family, his mom, you know, so there's this kind of intimacy, but still statements like South LA is better, that there's not so many black people here. And every night when she goes to bed, she sleeps with her little granddaughter who hugs her little 9-year-old granddaughter who's who's African American and Salvadoran. Mrs. Carrillo was slightly different, but also from El Salvador, came at the same time, same story. They scrimped and saved. They wanted to buy a house. This is the only place they could afford it. But she took a different strategy. She wanted her children to be with African Americans. In fact, she said she had to go to the school every year and fight with the principal who wanted to put the kids in bilingual ed. She wanted them in English only. She sought out contact with African Americans. She herself did not speak a lot of English, had not learned much English. But she would take her kids. At the time, there was a program at the library where elderly African American volunteers would read to the children in English, and that's what she wanted, and that's what she did. She also, so there's this black parental mentorship, another theme that's coming up. In high school, her children were bussed out to the San Fernando Valley. One of them went to an Ivy League school, got an MBA, and decided she did not want to work in business, has come back to the community to work as a math teacher, and which is a similar kind of story. And then Mrs. Carrillo's other daughter went to the University of California, which is not very shabby. It's amazing, but she felt like, that daughter didn't do as well. Like, you know, just like one of these never happy moms. So varied experiences. A Latino civic leader told us in the 90s, there was always this thing my parents would say, cierra la puerta porque se va a meter un negro. Close the door because a black person's going to get in the house. You get this visceral shutting in, shutting down. But we also got second generation people talking very, I thought, very astutely about you know, how this has changed, right? Others, you know, saying that, yeah, it's really not that dangerous. And a lot of second generation youth have criticized their parents and have tried to do a re-education program with their parents, although I think a greater civic education program is needed. You know, so this person said, so Latino immigrants, in our effort to become Americanized and indoctrinated into America, we just believe what America teaches us, and America hates blacks, right? I see it as part of American culture. Right? Somebody else just said, everybody's grandma's racist. The older you are, the more racist you are. Right? You know, a millennial, right? It's got it all. You know, so a change over time. The second generation did have frustration, but also empathy for their parents, most of whom remained monolingual Spanish speakers or who learned a bit of English. Because it is possible to work in immigrant enclaves for 20 or 30 years and not need to know English. So we get, you know, quotes like this from a second generation. I think they were more sheltered because, you know, my mom's at home, my dad's like at work, so they're out and about in the community. Like, they're not really interacting with the realities of South LA. Someone else said, our parents, you know, they're immigrants, so they kind of feel comfortable, kind of staying in their own little comfort zone. They're not very interested in learning about community history because they have other things on their mind, like working, like their kids. And then, you know, language barrier was often offered by a lot of people as well. What was the second generation experience? One person says, we grew up together. They fed us collard greens, we fed them beans. You know, we grew up in each other's homes. We grew up together. They're our people. We struggle, we consider them our people, which is not to say there was not black-brown conflict at some of the high schools as they were growing up, but this was the dominant narrative we kept hearing. Latinos who have black friends, who found commonality through sports, through social life. And as this last quote, you know, kind of gets at the woman I talked about too. A lot more relationships are becoming interracial, and I feel African American people, it's something of a norm to hear that my son's getting married to a Latina, they're having wedding. And I like what this woman we're calling Annalisa Campana said. She said, I feel like in South LA you get more of the flavor. Like you're in tune with your African American community. Like East LA, we got a lot of anti-East LA, a lot of anti-nationalistic Chicano sentiment. Like East LA, they're probably more Americanized, but they're probably more Mexican American and Latino or Salvadoran. You know, they're more tied to their culture. But here, you're more mixed in. So we found a lot of this kind of distancing among the second generation from East LA. The guy we're calling Fernando says, you might be Latino in East LA, you might grow up with a hatred for African Americans. It might sound ridiculous when I say it, but I know for a fact that there are whole housing projects in East LA who, if an African American moves in, they will actually come to your door and ask you to move out because they don't like black people living there. And in fact, there was a firebombing in East LA housing project after this happened. And somebody else, Staples Center is part of a downtown, there's kind of like this downtown, you know, entertainment center where the Lakers play, and when they built it, they had to, community partnership agreement, which meant they had to provide jobs to people in the local community. And Pedro here says, I work in Staples Center, so you have people from the east side that actually do need to work on their relationships with African Americans, because let's hang out, who's going? Yeah, but yeah, he's black. That kind of sucks. Right here in the South Side, it's easy to get to know people and make friendship, no matter the ethnicity, he says. And this was an interview I did. This was the woman who went to Ivy League college, got the MBA, and is back working as a teacher. She said, My cousins who grew up in Lincoln Heights or East LA, they will make comments, ignorant comments, that have to do with race when they refer to African Americans. And both my sister and I react very differently. To us, it's like you're talking about our extended family, almost because it did become like an extended family. They were the ones that were around here, that would see me walk home, that were extending a helping hand to my parents when they needed it. So what's the conclusion here? Well, you know, Latino immigrant integration is not monolithic. We're picking up really big differences between the first and second generation, although we're finding this incredible love of place and desire to make home. I haven't even talked about home ownership. Spatial transformation, this concept of racial ethnic sedimentation is something I want to, you know, work through. Something I haven't discussed today is the problem of weak civic engagement and knowledge among Latinos, especially first-generation Latinos. The first part, you know, all of the population has changed, all of the representatives are still African Americans, and we do see a lot of ignorance from the first generation in particular. So I'm really trying to push, you know, the framework I hope to develop, it's not yet developed, is immigrant integration as a homemaking process that's with generational and racial dimensions. And we have this online report. This was just our kind of first, you know, the fast and dirty report that emerged from this study. Thank you for listening to me. I'm happy to hear any questions or comments you have. Thanks.